The winter of 1546 settled cold and heavy upon England, a season that seemed to mirror the failing body of its king. Henry VIII, once a figure of towering strength and grandeur, now lay trapped inside his own swollen, decaying flesh. He had been a monarch of power, a man who bent kingdoms and churches to his will. But in those final months, the shadow of death walked beside him more closely than any courtier or servant. His body had become a battlefield, every movement a war against agony, every breath a reminder of the mortality he had spent a lifetime denying. Gone was the tall, athletic prince who had once dazzled the people with his vitality. Now Henry's frame was grotesquely bloated, his legs wrapped in foul-smelling bandages to hide ulcers that refused to heal. The stench from his wounds filled his chambers, so much so that even the most loyal attendants struggled to remain near him for long. Beneath the silks and velvets of his royal garments, his body was a ruin, rotting before he was even laid in the grave. Yet despite his condition, he clung to life with a ferocity that seemed almost unnatural, as though sheer willpower might defy the decay of flesh. The court around him was thick with whispers. Who would inherit? Who would rise? Who would fall? In the silence of the corridors, men who had once trembled before the king's gaze now prepared for the world beyond him. They watched him carefully, knowing his moods could swing from tenderness to wrath in a heartbeat, even as his body failed him. To anger Henry in his final days was still to court death. Yet his eyes, once sharp and commanding, had grown clouded with pain and suspicion. He no longer trusted easily. He no longer forgave at all. It was in these final days that the grandeur of the Tudor court seemed most like a stage play. Gilded halls, glittering torches, feasts laid out with gold and silver plate, all of it trying desperately to mask the truth. Their king was dying, and he was dying horribly. The man who had once ruled with thunder now lived in a prison of his own flesh. His appetite, once legendary, only worsened his condition. He consumed vast amounts of food and drink even when his body screamed against it. His doctors pleaded moderation. But Henry raged at the very suggestion of denial. He would not be told what he could or could not eat, not after a lifetime of demanding obedience from all around him. Night after night, Henry's groans echoed through Whitehall Palace. Servants whispered of how he cried out in the darkness, the pain from his ulcers and failing kidneys reducing him to something less than human. Some said they saw him talk to shadows, as though ghosts of his past haunted his bedchamber, the wives he had cast aside, the friends he had executed, the countless souls who had suffered because of his ruthless pursuit of power. Whether these were hallucinations or nightmares born of guilt, no one dared to ask. But those who stood at his bedside swore they heard him mutter names long dead. Yet even as death stalked him, Henry refused to relinquish his authority. He still signed orders, he still demanded reports, he still commanded loyalty with the threat of execution. The fear of the king remained as strong as ever, and no man dared to openly defy him. But in the shadows, alliances were forming, futures being calculated. Everyone knew that Henry's reign was ending, and with it, the kingdom would be thrown into uncertainty. His son, Edward, was young and frail. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, waited in the wings, each with their own claim, and their own enemies. The end of Henry's life was not just the end of a man. It was the prelude to a storm that would shape England for generations. Day by day, Henry grew weaker. His massive body could no longer bear its own weight. He was carried by servants in specially constructed chairs, his once proud stride reduced to helpless dependence. The king who had inspired both love and terror now inspired pity. His voice, once thunderous and commanding, often broke into rasps of exhaustion. But even then, even as his body collapsed around him, his pride remained unbroken. To the end, he demanded to be treated as the great monarch he had always believed himself to be. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when Henry seemed to reflect upon his life. He spoke little of his wives, though the memory of them lingered in the air. Catherine of Aragon, whom he had cast aside in his desperate need for a male heir. Anne Boleyn, executed at his command, her head severed with a single stroke. Jane Seymour, the only one he called his true queen, dead from childbirth. Anne of Cleves, dismissed and ridiculed. Catherine Howard, young and beautiful, sent to the block for her betrayal. And Catherine Parr, his final wife, who now walked carefully around his moods, balancing the affection of a nurse with the fear of a consort. The ghosts of these women seemed to gather around Henry's bed, silent witnesses to the downfall of the man who had changed their fates forever. The physicians who attended him knew the truth, though they dared not speak it aloud. The king was dying. His body was riddled with infection, his heart strained, his kidneys failing. They applied poultices to his ulcers, drained the pus from his sores, tried in vain to bring him comfort. But there was no cure, no treatment that could reverse the march of time and disease. The only thing they could do was prolong his suffering, a reality that weighed heavily upon the court. For who would be the one to tell the king that death had come for him? Henry himself refused to hear it. Any mention of death was forbidden in his presence. To suggest that the king might die was an act of treason in itself. He clung to the illusion of immortality, as though by sheer denial he could banish the grim reaper from his chamber. But no denial, no earthly power, could halt the decay that consumed him from within. As the weeks dragged on, Henry's temper grew more volatile. He lashed out at those closest to him, accusing them of betrayal, of disloyalty, of plotting his downfall. Courtiers who once sought his favor now feared even to look him in the eye. His words could still condemn a man to death, and in those days he did not hesitate to remind them of it. Yet behind the anger there was fear, a fear so deep it cracked the very mask of kingship he had worn all his life. In the silence of the night, when the court had withdrawn and only the flicker of candlelight remained, Henry was left alone with his pain. It was in those hours, some whispered, that the great king wept. His cries were muffled, but those who stood guard outside his chamber heard them. They heard him beg for relief, beg for deliverance, beg for an end to the torment. For a man who had commanded armies, who had defied popes, who had broken the very structure of Christendom, this was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. To be brought so low, so helpless, by his own failing body. But still, he lived on. Each morning the sun rose upon a king who was less a ruler than a relic, a man whose body betrayed him but whose will refused surrender. England waited. The court waited. The world waited. For all knew that when Henry finally drew his last breath, it would not simply be the death of a king. It would be the death of an era, an ending drenched in pain, fear, and the haunting shadow of the man who had once called himself the greatest monarch of his age. And so the days stretched forward, each one darker, each one heavier, as the final chapter of Henry VIII's life drew closer. His body crumbled, his mind faltered, his spirit raged. The world outside Whitehall moved on, but within the palace walls, time seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when death would finally claim the king. And with it, Henry's suffering grew unbearable. His vast frame, once a symbol of majesty, had become a grotesque burden. The ulcers on his legs spread, oozing with infection despite the endless ministrations of his doctors. The smell of rot clung to him so thickly that courtiers carried scented herbs and cloths to mask it. Yet even this stench could not fully veil the truth. Their king was no longer a man of flesh and blood, but a living corpse, a monarch decaying on his throne. He remained in Whitehall, confined to chambers filled with rich tapestries, golden candlesticks, and polished silver. But none of it brought him comfort. Surrounded by luxury, he was nonetheless imprisoned by pain, by fear, by the ghosts of his past. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by visions. Some nights he screamed himself awake, babbling about shadows and accusing the air of betrayal. Other nights he fell into a silence so deep his attendants leaned close, wondering if at last the end had come, only for him to stir once more, gasping, clutching for breath. The court walked on eggshells. His fury could still fall like a guillotine, sudden and deadly. Even in his weakness, Henry remained king, and his word still held the power to condemn. His paranoia sharpened. He accused ministers of treachery, suspected his wives of disloyalty even from the grave, and doubted even the loyalty of Catherine Parr, who tended him with dutiful patience. She smiled and soothed, reading to him from Scripture, hiding her own terror behind carefully measured words. One wrong phrase, one careless sentence, and she too could have shared the fate of Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard. And yet, beneath the weight of suspicion, there was a deepening awareness that Henry's reign was ending. The nobles whispered of the succession. Edward, the long-awaited son, was a fragile boy of 9, thin and often ill. Could he truly bear the crown of England? Some placed their hopes in Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, but she was Catholic, a threat to the Reformation Henry had forced upon his kingdom. Others looked to Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, sharp and clever, though still young and untested. The future of England trembled in the balance, and all the while the king lay wasting away, clinging to his throne like a man drowning in the sea. His mind returned again and again to his legacy. He spoke of his palaces, his conquests in France, the glory of his navy, his break from Rome. He demanded that those around him acknowledge his greatness, that his memory would not be stained by weakness or death. Yet the courtiers, though they bowed and flattered, knew the truth. They knew that this once mighty king was ending not in triumph, but in decay, his greatness swallowed by disease and torment. As January of 1547 arrived, the chill seeped into the very walls of Whitehall. Henry's condition worsened. He could barely rise from his bed, and when he did, he had to be lifted by servants, his massive body requiring the strength of several men to move. His meals were brought to him. Rich feasts he could scarcely eat. He drank heavily, as if drowning. His pain in ale and wine might banish it. The doctors watched helplessly. His pulse was weak, his breath shallow, his body swollen with fluids. The end was close, yet no one dared tell him. In those days, it was considered treason to speak to the king of his own death. Even his closest advisers circled the truth cautiously. They reminded him of his son, of the future, of God's mercy. But to tell him openly that he was dying, that was dangerous beyond measure. And so Henry was left in a strange half-light, knowing within his bones that death was near, but forbidden to face it plainly. One man, Sir Anthony Denny, the chief gentleman of the Privy Chamber, at last found the courage to speak. In a quiet voice, he told Henry that he was nearing the end of his earthly life and urged him to prepare his soul. At first, the king raged. His pride rebelled against the suggestion. But when the fury ebbed, Henry fell into a silence more terrible than anger. He asked for a priest. He asked for God's forgiveness. The man who had torn his kingdom away from the Pope now sought absolution on his deathbed. He confessed his sins, though perhaps not all of them. How could one man confess the blood of so many? Wives executed, friends destroyed, monasteries razed, thousands dead in the wake of his policies. Yet he asked, in his own way, for mercy. He called upon Christ to receive his soul, and though no one knew the depth of his sincerity, the court whispered that the king had at last faced the judgment he had so long evaded. His last days were filled with delirium. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling for Jane Seymour, the only wife he had loved, the one who gave him his son. At other times, he muttered darkly, his words unintelligible, as though conversing with figures only he could see. The priests read prayers over him. Catherine Parr remained at his side when she could, though even she was often ordered away when his temper flared. Finally, on the night of January 27, 1547, Henry VIII slipped into his final hours. The candlelight flickered across his bedchamber. Outside, the court waited in tense silence, knowing that the breath of their king was faltering. His attendants stood by, watching his chest rise and fall with ragged effort. The once mighty roar of his voice was now a whisper. His enormous body, bloated and broken, shuddered with every breath. As dawn approached, Henry VIII, King of England, breathed his last. He died at Whitehall, aged 55, consumed by the very excesses that had defined his life. The silence that followed was immense. The courtiers who had feared him for decades now stood in awe of the stillness, as though the very palace itself held its breath. After years of commanding armies, bending nations, and destroying all who opposed him, Henry was at last powerless, his throne empty, his soul gone to meet its maker. In the days that followed, the court moved swiftly. Edward VI was proclaimed king, though his small frame and fragile health gave little comfort to those who dreamed of stability. Mary and Elizabeth waited, each watching, each calculating, for their time would come. Henry's body, massive and grotesque even in death, was laid in a coffin that strained to contain him. He was interred at Windsor, beside Jane Seymour, the wife he had loved most. But even in death, his body betrayed him. Stories spread that the coffin leaked, that dogs licked the blood that seeped from it. Whether true or not, it was a fitting image for the end of a king whose life had been marked by both grandeur and brutality. And so the reign of Henry VIII ended not with triumph, but with horror. His legacy was carved in both glory and blood, the creation of the Church of England, the strengthening of the monarchy, the destruction of all who opposed him. To some, he was a tyrant, a monster who brought suffering to thousands. To others, he was a visionary, a king who reshaped England forever. But in those final days, stripped of power, stripped of dignity, Henry was nothing more than a man in torment, a king haunted by the ghosts of his past, a body collapsing beneath the weight of its own excess. The story of Henry's last days is not merely the tale of one man's death. It is the tale of power, of ambition, of the fragile line between greatness and ruin. For Henry VIII, death was not swift nor merciful. It was drawn out, cruel, a punishment of the flesh for a lifetime of sins. His court remembered not the handsome prince who once rode proudly into battle, but the bloated tyrant who screamed, in the night, begging for relief. His subjects remembered not the laughter of his youth, but the executions, the broken vows, the shattered lives, and yet history cannot forget him. His name endures, carved into the very foundation of England's story. His final days remain a haunting reminder that even the mightiest king cannot escape the judgment of time, nor the decay of the body. In the end, Henry VIII died as all men, die alone in pain, leaving behind a world he could no longer control.